Hi, my name is Shauna Winram. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University. And the name of this talk is Psychosis a Distinct Global State of Consciousness? Now, if I can just get my mouse working. Why won't it work? Here we go. Okay. So psychosis refers to experiences whose core features include hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thoughts. And it's a symptom of illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And there's no consensus about biomarkers that account for these illnesses. Instead, psychiatrists rely on lists of symptoms to diagnose people. And this is why novel approaches are required to better understand these disorders. And this is important because better treatment outcomes are needed. So I'll begin by discussing what dimensions of consciousness are and what global states of consciousness are. Then I'll discuss my research, and then I'll discuss some problems with the concept of a global state. So when I say consciousness, I'm referring to phenomenal consciousness, or our subjective first-person experience, and this includes things such as perception, sensations, emotions, etc. And along with Bain and Hovey, I take it that consciousness varies along numerous dimensions. And these include level of arousal, how the contents are experienced, for example, their number and quality, the structure of consciousness, and this includes how we experience time, attention, unity, and the self, and various functions of consciousness. And this refers to how accessible contents are to systems in the brain, such as working memory and decision-making, etc. When a creature is conscious, they must be conscious in a particular way, and these distinct ways of being conscious are known as global states. And they include the normal waking state, REM dreaming, states of being under light anesthetic, and states induced by psychedelics. So the idea is that a global state is a natural grouping of dimensions that doesn't vary greatly across instances of those global states, and that's distinct from other global states. So the idea is a dimension can be experienced in various ways. For example, with level of arousal, we can experience that as low arousal when we're under light anesthetics, or high arousal when we're on amphetamines. And we should be able to hypothetically rate these dimensions on a scale. And the assumption here is when these dimensions change in some predictable way, for example, level of arousal, or how the contents are experienced, or how time or attention is experienced. When these change in some predictable way, a creature is going to move from one global state to another. So this is an attempt at a definition of a global state. If you want to know if two subjects, X and Y, are in the same global state at a given time, the first condition I've got here is that X is in the same global state at Y at time T, if and only if X and Y are both in a subclass S of all conscious subjects at that given time T. So we have a major class of all conscious subjects at that time, and they're a subclass. The second condition is that every member of this subclass has a similar rating regarding the dimensions I've outlined. So we'll call them A, B, and C. And the third condition here is that this subclass is a natural class. And the reason we stipulate this is because we want to be able to make inductive inferences or generalizations from about members in this subclass. And the fourth condition I'm not sure of, but if X and Y are in this subclass or global state, they're not simultaneously in another global state. I'm going to return to this definition later in the talk and suggest some problems with it. Okay, so now I'll discuss my research. One of my research questions is psychosis a distinct global state of consciousness? And my hypothesis is, if the quantitative and qualitative ratings regarding the various dimensions of consciousness remain constant during all cases of psychosis, then psychosis is a distinct global state. And my method to determine this is twofold. So firstly, I'm conducting an online survey with participants who've experienced psychosis, and I'm still collecting this data. But part one of the survey determines how psychosis varies from the normal waking state regarding these various dimensions I've discussed. So, for example, with level of arousal, I asked participants to rate on a scale from 1 to 7, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, whether during their last psychotic episode they felt more awake than normal or more energized than normal, etc. So this is a way of getting quantitative ratings regarding these various dimensions. I've also conducted 16 one-hour Zoom interviews with participants who have experienced psychosis, and I've asked them to describe these experiences. And I've begun to analyze this data with NVivo software. So this is a screenshot of NVivo, and this middle column here is some of my codes. I have a lot more codes than that. But with NVivo, you begin by slowly going through the interview and descriptively coding what you find. And what you find when you do that is you get more fine-grained descriptions than what you find in the literature. And you also find themes emerging that you don't find in the literature. Things like attitudes such as conviction, or the desire for anonymity or peace and seclusion, or obsession, preoccupation, interconnectedness of things, synchronicity, disassociation. They're some of the themes that are emerging. Anyway, now I'm going to read some quotes from participants, and this is to illustrate how participants experience these various dimensions in different ways. So I'll begin with a participant who's describing an experience of depression and how delusional thinking can emerge in that state. And they said, "I can sit for hours and stare. It really feels like my head is full of glue, and all of the cogs have ground to a very sticky halt. And I think that's probably what makes what I now recognize as the delusional thinking and those thoughts so much more vivid, because there's not a lot of other thinking going on." This contrasts with the next participant who said, "I was definitely a bit more manic than I usually am, and I had a lot of problems with racing thoughts. So I'd think a lot about things, but my thinking was hindered. I'd be thinking about sort of paranoia and stuff and the conspiracies more than normally. So I was probably heightenedly sort of focused, but I'd be focused on really weird things like the birds having microtransmitters on." So both of these participants are experiencing delusional thinking, but one seems to have heightened arousal and one seems to have lower arousal. In terms of the quality of contents, I'll compare these participants in terms of how they experience perception and sensation. So participant one said, "Certainly some of the things I'm aware of as my mood starts to escalate is that a lot of my senses become a lot more heightened. I exist in a state of heightened sensory perception anyway. So I'm very sensitive to sound and to light and to touch in particular. And as my mood goes up, that will shift from just being hypersensitive to these things to starting to perceive things that aren't actually there." And this contrasts with participant 2, who said, "When you say heightened perception, see, I wouldn't say it was like a drug experience or anything. I'll say I was more manic and I was definitely moodier, but I don't think I recognize this as being, oh, wow, I can see clearer, or you know what I mean." In terms of time, participant 5 suggested that time sped up, and they said, "So there's stuff you feel, think, see, hear, sense that other people don't. So I have an awareness of that. I think it's an experience where things have sped up and you can't slow down, like a hyperdrive type of thing." And this contrasts with participant 7, who suggested things slow down, and they said, "Things will slow down around the threat, and you'll become hyper-focused on the threat, and things will drop away that are not essential to that threat. I would say hyper-vigilant on the threat." In terms of the self, participant 5 suggested they became sort of a younger version of themselves. They said, it's like a feeling that I can't keep up, like the inner world is bigger than the outside world. And I asked, but you haven't changed. The sense of you as a person, you're still the same person. And they answered, I am, but I'm probably younger. It's earlier life stuff. So, like their memories from the past. My husband said, when I'm in these states, it's really painful and awful, but I'm also very funny and childlike. And this contrasts to participant 6, who seemed to lose their sense of self. And they said, I didn't know who I was. I just knew that I didn't know where I was. I didn't know the time. I just always thought it was daylight because they were outside. I thought I was in the bush and I was just focused on escaping so they couldn't bury me alive. I knew I was me. I described myself to me as me, but I didn't know my name and I didn't know anything about me. So this illustrates how participants seem to experience these dimensions in a variety of ways. And this leads to a preliminary conclusion, which is that the ratings of different dimensions vary across cases of psychosis. Therefore, psychosis is not a distinct global state. And the problem here is that given that definition that I gave earlier in the talk, members of a global state should have similar ratings regarding these various dimensions. But this doesn't seem to be the case in psychosis. These ratings seem to vary. But this may also generalize to other global states, for example, REM dreaming. So imagine one night you're dreaming, you're having a nightmare, and you score a 10 on the quality of contents, but the next night scores a 1 in terms of vividness. And correspondingly, the level of arousal can vary quite a lot. And presumably, time, attention, unity, and the self can vary quite a lot. So it's hard to know what's doing the work here in terms of defining REM as a global state. If the contents and the structure can vary so much, it might be the function doing more work. Anyway, so I'll try... and I'll discuss problems with the definition that I gave earlier. But firstly, this is a problem for my work because when I began my PhD, I began with the assumption that if I could rate these various dimensions, I could firstly say why psychosis is distinct to the normal waking state. And that's my first research question. And then I could also look at how similar or different distinct cases of psychosis were, and then answer whether psychosis was a distinct global state. And that's my second research question. Okay, so this is the definition I started with. I'm just going to concentrate on the second condition here. And this has 2 parts. So it's got the ratings and the dimensions. And I'll begin with the dimensions. We don't know all the relevant dimensions when it comes to defining a global state. I've listed some out of the literature, say A, B, and C. But there might be more than that. Well, presumably there are more than that. And some of the ones that I've mentioned may not be very relevant when it comes to defining a global state. And then we don't know the conditions on these dimensions. So I've said that the ratings of dimensions is important, but the relative weighting of dimensions could also be very important. For example, if you're moving from REM dreaming to the normal waking state, it's going to be the level of arousal that's doing more work there than the spread of attention. And the interconnectedness of dimensions could also be important, and we don't know how interconnected these dimensions are. So as an example, spread of attention seems to be correlated with changes in other dimensions when it changes. So if you're really focused on something, your sense of self may drop away, your sense of unity may increase, your control over attention may increase, the quality of what you're focused on may increase, and what you're focused on may be more accessible to systems like working memory, etc. And there may be more conditions that I'm not mentioning that are important when it comes to defining a global state. So this is an attempt at a second definition. All I've done here is add in the weightings and interconnectedness and these other unknown relevant conditions. I'm still unsure if this works because I'm still assuming that the members of a global state have similar ratings regarding these various dimensions. And I've already shown that that may not be the case. Okay, so this is a preliminary conclusion, but the results seem to suggest that psychosis is not a distinct global state according to the definition I gave at the beginning of the talk, or D1. However, that definition may need to be revised. I've suggested D2. Is psychosis a global state regarding that definition? I'm not sure. This is a work in progress. Just briefly, the significance of this: if we find that psychosis is a distinct global state, that allows us to make inductive inferences from one case to another, which could have implications for treatment. If it's not a distinct global state, then looking for other natural groupings of dimensions could suggest new taxonomies of these disorders. And this work could also suggest new directions to look for biomarkers. Thank you. This is a drawing by my supervisor when we were discussing this work. So thank you very much for your time.